The gunshot echoing across the dusty Wyoming plains was what saved Grace Davis's life, though she wouldn't know it until later. The year was 1883, and as the widow stared down the barrel of a revolver pointed at her 7-year-old son's head, time seemed to stand still in the worst possible way. "I said gather up what valuables you got, woman, or the boy gets it first," growled the man in the filthy bowler hat, his whiskey-soured breath filling the small cabin Grace had called home for the past 5 years. "Mama," her daughter Emma whimpered from where she was pressed against the wall, barely 6 years old and trembling like a leaf in a windstorm. Grace's fingers fumbled with the latch on the small wooden box where she kept her few pieces of jewelry, her mother's locket, her wedding band, and the brooch her late husband had given her before consumption claimed him 2 winters ago. The box represented everything she had left of value, but it meant nothing compared to her children. "Please," she whispered, "take it all. Just don't hurt my babies." The second intruder, a rail-thin man with a pock-marked face, chuckled as he upended a drawer onto the floor. "Oh, we'll be taking it all right, and maybe these little ones too. Ransom's good money these days." The blood drained from Grace's face. "No, you can't. Shut your mouth." The first man pressed the gun harder against young Joseph's temple, making the boy whimper. "Or I'll make sure you won't have no reason to worry about these brats no more." The third shot came suddenly, splintering the cabin's front door. The intruders whirled, momentarily distracted, and in that split second, Grace lunged forward, grabbing Joseph and pulling him against her chest. "What the devil?" The thin man didn't finish his sentence as the door crashed open, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "I believe you gentlemen are trespassing." The voice was deep, steady as a mountain, and carried the unmistakable thread of violence beneath its calm exterior. The man in the bowler hat swung his revolver toward the doorway, but he wasn't fast enough. 2 more shots rang out in quick succession. The first struck his hand, sending the weapon clattering to the floor. The second hit the thin man in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the wall. "Next one goes between your eyes," said the stranger, stepping fully into the cabin. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath several days' worth of stubble. Dark hair peeked out from under a worn Stetson, and eyes the color of a summer storm assessed the situation with calculating precision. "These children," he said slowly, his revolver unwavering, "they belong with me." The bowler-hatted man clutched his bleeding hand. "The hell they do. Jacob Young, United States Marshal." The stranger pulled back his duster just enough to reveal a silver badge pin to his vest. "And I'm giving you boys exactly 10 seconds to clear out before I decide Wyoming could use a couple less vermin." The thin man struggled to his feet, blood seeping through his shirt. "This ain't worth dying over, Harley. Let's go." Bowler Hat Harley glared with hatred, but seemed to recognize the odds had turned against him. "This ain't over," he spat as he backed toward the door, his injured partner already stumbling outside. "Oh, I think it is," Marshal Young replied, his aim never wavering until both men had mounted their horses and disappeared down the trail in a cloud of dust. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn his full attention to Grace and her children. The woman stood protectively in front of her son and daughter, a kitchen knife now clutched in her trembling hand. "Mrs. Davis," he said, holstering his revolver slowly to show he meant no threat, "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but it seemed the situation called for immediate action." "How do you know my name?" Grace demanded, the knife still held before her. "I've been tracking those men for 3 weeks. They've robbed half a dozen homesteads between here and Cheyenne, killed 2 men, and—" He paused, glancing at the children. "Let's just say they've done worse." Joseph, braver than his years might suggest, stepped slightly forward. "Are you really a marshal, mister?" A hint of a smile touched Jacob's lips as he crouched down to the boy's level. "I surely am, son. See this badge? That means I'm one of the good guys." "Why did you say we belong with you?" Grace asked, her voice steadier now but still wary. Jacob stood, meeting her gaze directly. "Madam, those men were likely to shoot me regardless. By claiming some connection to you and your children, I figured I might confuse them just long enough to gain an advantage." He paused. It worked. Grace slowly lowered the knife. "I don't know how to thank you, Marshal Young." "Jacob, please." He glanced around the small cabin, noting the overturned furniture and scattered belongings. "And you can thank me by accepting my help to set this place right again." "That's very kind, but—" "Mrs. Davis, those men might come back with friends. At least allow me to stay until nightfall. Make sure you're properly secured." Grace looked at her children, their eyes wide with lingering fear, then back at the marshal. His expression was earnest, his offer genuine. After 2 years of managing everything alone, the prospect of even temporary assistance was almost overwhelming. "All right, Marshal. You can stay for dinner at the very least." Jacob nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Neither could have known in that moment how their lives had just irrevocably changed, or that the lie he'd told to save them would eventually become the most honest truth he'd ever spoken. As the afternoon light filtered through the cabin windows, Jacob helped Grace right the furniture, while the children slowly emerged from their fear. Little Emma, initially hiding behind her mother's skirts, eventually approached the tall Marshal with cautious curiosity. "Mr. Marshal," she said solemnly, tugging on his duster, "do you catch bad men all the time?" Jacob set down the table he'd been positioning and knelt to her level. "That's my job, little lady, to make sure good folks like you and your mama stay safe." "Papa used to keep us safe," she said, her small face serious, "but he went to heaven." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, a softening around the eyes that Grace noticed from where she was sweeping up broken crockery. "I'm sorry to hear that," he replied, his voice gentler than before. "Your papa must have been a very brave man." Joseph, arranging books back onto a small shelf, looked over. "He was. He fought in the war and everything. But then he got sick." Jacob nodded solemnly. "A lot of good men did." Grace cleared her throat. "Children, why don't you go fetch water from the pump so we can start dinner? Marshal Young must be hungry after his journey." Once the children had scampered outside, staying within view of the windows, Grace turned to Jacob. "Thank you again. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did." Jacob ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Those men have a reputation, Mrs. Davis. They're part of the Blackwater gang. Started out robbing stagecoaches, but lately they've been targeting isolated homesteads." He paused. "Particularly those run by women alone." Grace's hand stilled on the broom. "How did they know?" "Small towns talk. Word gets around about who might be vulnerable." He glanced out the window at the children. "They've taken hostages before, for ransom when they could get it." A chill ran through Grace despite the warmth of the day. "And when they couldn't?" Jacob's silence was answer enough. "I have neighbors," Grace said after a moment. "The Hendersons about 3 miles east, and the Wilsons to the north." "Too far if trouble comes fast," Jacob observed. "Do you have a gun?" "My husband's rifle. I know how to use it." Jacob nodded approvingly. "Good. But those men might return with the rest of their gang. 5 or 6 of them altogether, from what I've gathered." Grace straightened her shoulders. "What would you suggest, Marshal? I can't abandon our home. This land is all we have. Jacob studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined stance, the pride evident despite her worn dress and the fatigue lining her face. This was a woman who had already weathered storms most would have buckled under. "I'd suggest you let me stay a few days," he finally said, "at least until I'm certain they've moved on. I can sleep in your barn." "I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition, Mrs. Davis. It's my duty." He glanced toward the door where the children's voices could be heard as they returned with the water bucket between them. "Besides, I meant what I said about tracking these men. If they return, they'll be leading me right to the rest of their gang." Grace hesitated, weighing her pride against her children's safety. In the end, there is no real choice. "Very well, Marshal. But you'll take your meals with us proper, not out in the barn like some hired hand." A hint of a smile played at his lips. "Yes, madam." The children burst through the door, Joseph proudly carrying the full water bucket, while Emma announced importantly, "I helped." That evening, Grace prepared a simple but hearty stew with the last of her rabbit meat and vegetables from her small garden. The children, initially shy, soon warmed to Jacob's presence, especially when he regaled them with carefully edited stories of his adventures tracking outlaws through the territories. "Did you ever get shot?" Joseph asked, with the morbid fascination typical of boys his age. "Joseph," Grace admonished, "that's not proper dinner conversation." Jacob chuckled. "It's all right." He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a puckered scar on his forearm. "Just once. A bank robber in Nebraska territory. Taught me to be quicker on the draw." Emma's eyes went wide. "Did it hurt awful bad?" "Like fire," Jacob admitted. "But a kind doctor patched me up good as new." He flexed his arm to demonstrate. "See? Works just fine now." "Is that why you became a marshal?" Joseph asked. "To catch bank robbers?" A shadow crossed Jacob's face briefly. "No, son. I became a marshal because my younger brother was killed by men who thought they were above the law. I figured somebody needed to show them otherwise." The table fell silent for a moment before Grace gently changed the subject. "Children, after dinner you need to wash up and get ready for bed. It's been a long day." Later, after the children had been tucked in and the cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fire, Grace brought Jacob a cup of coffee where he sat at the table, cleaning his revolver with practiced efficiency. "Your children are a credit to you, Mrs. Davis," he said as she sat across from him. "Grace," she offered, "if you're to stay with us a while, you might as well use my given name." He nodded. "Grace, then." He reassembled his weapon with swift, sure movements. "How long have you been managing this place alone?" 2 years come November." She cradled her own coffee cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "Thomas, my husband, he had a cough that wouldn't go away." By the time we realized how serious it was, she trailed off. "I'm sorry." Grace straightened her shoulders slightly. "We manage. The children help as much as they can. Joseph's becoming quite the little farmer." Jacob studied her face in the firelight, the determination in her green eyes, the resilience evident in the set of her jaw despite the exhaustion that lined her features. Most women in her situation would have returned east to family or remarried out of necessity. Her independence was both admirable and concerning, given the dangers of frontier life. "What about your family? Is there no one who could help?" Grace shook her head. "My parents passed years ago. I have a sister in Boston, but she barely approved of my marriage, let alone our decision to come west." She took a sip of coffee. "What about you, Marshal? Is there a Mrs. Young wondering where you are tonight?" Jacob's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes shifted. No, this job doesn't lend itself to settling down. That seems a lonely way to live, says the widow raising 2 children on the edge of nowhere, he countered, though his tone held no judgment, only a quiet observation. Grace smiled faintly. Touché, Marshal. Jacob, he reminded her. Jacob, she echoed, and something indefinable passed between them in the quiet of the fire-lit cabin. The next morning, Jacob was up before dawn, checking the perimeter of Grace's small homestead. The cabin sat nestled in a slight depression, with her modest fields to the south and a small creek running along the eastern edge of the property. To the north and west stretched open prairie, offering little cover for anyone approaching with ill intent, a mixed blessing for defense. The barn was weathered but solid, housing a milk cow, 2 draft horses, and several chickens that clucked indignantly at his intrusion. A well-used plow and other farming implements hung neatly on the walls, testament to Grace's orderliness, despite her limited circumstances. By the time the sun crested the horizon, Jacob had identified the homestead's vulnerabilities and strengths. He was kneeling by the corner of the barn, examining fresh hoof prints when Grace approached, carrying a steaming mug. "I thought you might want coffee," she said, handing him the cup. She had already dressed for the day's work, her hair neatly pinned beneath a simple kerchief, her calico dress protected by a practical apron. "Thank you." He stood, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You're up early." "Cows don't milk themselves," she replied with a small smile, "and the children will be awake soon. Joseph helps with the chickens before his lessons." Jacob nodded toward the hoofprints. "You had visitors before yesterday, 3 days ago by the look of it." Grace's expression tightened. "Yes, they came by claiming to be lost, asked for directions to Clearwater." She frowned. "I thought it odd at the time. Clearwater's not hard to find from the main road." "They were scouting," Jacob confirmed, "checking for defenses, valuables, seeing if you were alone." A shiver ran through Grace despite the growing warmth of the morning. "They watched us for days before coming back." "It's their method. They're cautious, which is why they've evaded capture so long." Jacob took a sip of coffee. "But caution works both ways. They'll likely wait and watch again before making another attempt." "If they do," Grace said firmly, "I'll be ready this time." Jacob studied her for a moment. "I have no doubt of that, but perhaps we might improve your odds a bit." Throughout the morning, Jacob set about reinforcing the cabin's defenses while Grace went about her daily chores. He repaired a loose shutter, installed crude but effective bars on the back window, and fashioned a sturdier lock for the front door. Joseph followed him like a shadow, eager to help and full of questions about marshalling and outlaws. "Can I see your gun, Mr. Jacob?" the boy asked as they worked. "Joseph," Grace called from where she was hanging laundry. "That's not appropriate to ask." Jacob smiled slightly. "Your mother's right. A firearm isn't a toy, son. It's a tool, and a dangerous one." "But how am I supposed to protect Mama and Emma if I don't learn?" the boy asked earnestly. Something in Jacob's chest tightened at the child's words, at the burden of responsibility no 7-year-old should have to bear. He crouched to meet Joseph's eyes. "That's very brave of you to think that way," he said seriously. "But your job right now is to be a boy, to grow strong and learn all you can. Your mama protects you, not the other way around." "But Papa always said a man takes care of his family." Jacob glanced up at Grace, who had paused in her work, her expression a complex mixture of pride and heartache. "Your papa was right," Jacob said carefully. "But he'd also want you to be safe. Tell you what, with your mother's permission, I'll teach you to handle a rifle properly before I leave. But only if you promise to never, ever touch it without an adult present." Joseph's face lit up. "Really? Mama, can I?" Grace hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If Marshal Young thinks you're old enough to learn the safety rules, then yes. But Joseph, you must promise to obey exactly as he says." "I promise!" The boy beamed. Emma, not to be left out, tugged at Jacob's sleeve. "What about me? Can I learn too?" Jacob exchanged another look with Grace, who gave a small nod. "You can learn the safety rules," he told Emma gently. "So you know what's dangerous, but you're still a little young for handling it yourself." The little girl considered this, then nodded solemnly. "That's fair." By midday, the improvements to the cabin were substantial, if not perfect. Jacob joined Grace and the children for a simple lunch of bread and cheese, after which Grace announced it was time for lessons. "You teach them yourself?" Jacob asked as Grace gathered worn primers and slate boards. "Of course. The nearest school is in town, nearly 10 miles away." She smiled at her children. "Besides, they're quick learners." "I can read chapter books now," Joseph announced proudly. "And I can write all my letters," Emma added, not to be outdone. "Very impressive," Jacob said sincerely. "Would you like to join us, Marshal?" Grace asked. The children might enjoy having a new audience for their reading practice. Something about the domestic scene, the way sunlight streamed through the windows onto the simple table, the earnest faces of the children, Grace's quiet competence created an unexpected longing in Jacob's chest. For a moment he could almost imagine this was his life, a home, a family, purpose beyond the endless pursuit of justice. "I'd be honored," he said, "but first I should check the perimeter again. Perhaps I could join you afterward." Grace nodded, understanding his diligence. "Of course, we'll be here." Outside, Jacob walked the boundaries of the small farm, scanning the distant horizon for any sign of movement. The vast emptiness of the Wyoming landscape could be either blessing or curse, while it made approach difficult to conceal. It also meant help was far away if needed. As he completed his circuit, Jacob's thoughts returned to Grace and her children. Their vulnerability troubled him deeply, yet their resilience was remarkable. Most widows in Grace's position would have either remarried or returned east to family. Her determination to maintain independence spoke to an uncommon strength of character, and the children, bright, well-mannered despite their isolation, clearly adored by their mother. Joseph with his premature sense of responsibility, little Emma with her solemn questions and quick smile. Jacob was not a man given to sentimentality. His work had shown him too much of humanity's darker nature to harbor many illusions. Yet, something about this small family had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't experienced in years. When he returned to the cabin, the afternoon lesson was in full swing. Joseph was reading aloud from a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, while Emma practiced forming letters on her slate. Grace looked up as Jacob entered, offering a small smile that warmed something in his chest. "Just in time," she said. "Emma was hoping you might check her work." For the next hour, Jacob found himself immersed in the simple pleasure of education. He listened to Joseph's reading, offering encouragement when the boy stumbled over difficult words. He praised Emma's increasingly confident penmanship, and all the while he found his gaze drawn repeatedly to Grace, to the gentle patience with which she guided her children, to the intelligence evident in her explanations, to the quiet dignity she maintained despite circumstances that would have broken many. As the afternoon waned, Jacob offered to help with the evening chores. Together, he and Grace fed the animals while the children gathered eggs and brought in vegetables from the small kitchen garden. "You're good with them," Grace observed as they carried buckets of feed to the barn. "The children, I mean." Jacob shrugged slightly. "They're good children. Make it easy." "Still," she persisted, "not all men have the patience or the interest." He was saved from responding by Joseph's excited shout from the chicken coop. "Mama, Mr. Jacob, look how many eggs I found." The evening passed peacefully with a simple supper of vegetable stew and biscuits. Afterward, as promised, Jacob gave the children their first lesson in firearm safety, using his unloaded revolver as a demonstration. "The first rule," he said seriously, "is that every gun is always loaded, even when you know it isn't. That means you never ever point it at anything you don't intend to shoot." The children nodded solemnly, absorbing his words with appropriate gravity. "The second rule is to keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. And the third is to be absolutely certain of your target and what's beyond it." He continued the lesson with patience, explaining the mechanics in terms they could understand, answering their questions thoughtfully. Grace watched from her rocking chair, her hands busy with mending, her expression a mixture of concern and appreciation. When the children had been tucked into bed with the story Jacob surprising everyone, including himself, by offering to read to them, he joined Grace by the fire once more. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the lesson. It eases my mind to know they understand the dangers." "Joseph's a natural," Jacob observed. "Listens well, takes it seriously. Emma, too, though she's still young." Grace set aside her mending with a sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by them out here. If they're missing too much, being so isolated." "They're learning things most town children never will," Jacob pointed out. "Self-reliance, hard work, and they have you." He paused, then added softly, "That counts for a great deal, I'd say." Grace looked up, meeting his gaze. The firelight played across her features, softening them, highlighting the natural beauty that hardship had not diminished. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of mutual respect, or something deeper neither was ready to name. "Will you tell me about your brother?" she asked after a moment. "The one you mentioned." Jacob's expression shifted, grew more distant. "His name was Daniel. Younger than me by 4 years, always the idealist between us." He stared into the fire. "After the war, we both fought for the Union. He decided to study law. Believed in justice, in building something better out of all that bloodshed." He fell silent for a moment, and Grace waited patiently. "He was appointed prosecutor in a small Nebraska town. Started investigating cattle theft, seemed simple enough. Turned out the thieves had connections to the mayor, local businessmen. Daniel wouldn't back down, even when they threatened him." Jacob's jaw tightened. "They shot him on the steps of the courthouse, broad daylight. No one was ever charged." "I'm so sorry," Grace said softly. "I was a sheriff then, 2 counties over. When the territorial judge couldn't get justice, I took the marshal's badge. Figured I'd have more authority to cross boundaries, follow the evidence wherever it led." His eyes, when they met hers again, held banked fury and old pain. "Took 2 years, but I found every man involved, made sure they faced judgment one way or another." The implication hung in the air between them. Grace didn't ask for clarification, and Jacob offered none. "And after?" she asked instead. "Why continue as a marshal? Jacob considered the question. Seemed there was always another Daniel somewhere, another person who needed someone to stand between them and those who'd do them harm. He shrugged slightly. Became a habit, I suppose. A worthy one, Grace said quietly. Jacob studied her face in the firelight. What about you? Why stay here when it must be so difficult? Grace's gaze shifted to the small bedroom where her children slept. This land was Thomas's dream. He worked so hard for it, believed in it so completely. She smoothed her skirt absently. At first I stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat. Then, because the children were settled and they'd already lost their father. Now, she smiled faintly. Now I stay because it's ours. Because despite everything, we've made a life here. A good one, Jacob observed. Most days, she agreed, though I'll admit yesterday tested my resolve. You were protecting your children, Jacob said. I've seen trained men panic in similar situations. You kept your wits. Fear clarifies things, Grace replied, makes it very obvious what matters. They fell silent then, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a nighthawk, the only sounds breaking the stillness. It was a comfortable silence, the kind shared between people who have no need to fill the air with empty words. Later, as Jacob made his way to the barn where a makeshift bed awaited him, he found himself more reluctant to leave the cabin's warmth than he'd expected. Something about Grace Davis and her children had awakened feelings he'd long thought dormant, a yearning for connection, for purpose beyond his badge. It was dangerous thinking, he knew. His duty was to protect this family and bring the outlaws to justice, nothing more. Attachment would only complicate matters, cloud his judgment when clarity might be needed most. Yet as he settled onto the straw-filled pallet, Jacob couldn't help remembering the way Grace's eyes had softened in the firelight, or how naturally Joseph's small hand had fitted in his own during their lesson. For the first time in years, Jacob Young fell asleep thinking not of justice or retribution, but of possibility. Dawn broke with the symphony of roosters and bird song. Jacob rose with the first light, checking his weapons before making a careful circuit of the property. All seemed peaceful, but experience had taught him that peace was often most fragile just before it shattered. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when Grace emerged, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. "You're up early," she observed, watching as he swung the axe with practiced efficiency. Jacob paused, wiping his brow. "Figured I'd make myself useful." "Winter will be here before you know it." Grace's expression softened. "That's kind of you, though I should warn you that Joseph will be terribly disappointed to miss this. Chopping wood is usually a special job with supervision." "Then we'll save some for him," Jacob replied, setting another log on the stump. "But I noticed your pile was getting low." Grace studied him for a moment. "You don't have to earn your keep, Marshal." "Jacob," he reminded her, bringing the axe down with a satisfying crack. "And I know I don't have to, but idle hands don't suit me." A small smile touched Grace's lips. "Well, in that case, I won't stop you. Coffee will be ready soon." Throughout the day, a comfortable routine established itself. After breakfast, Jacob helped Grace with the heavier farm chores while she conducted the children's lessons. In the afternoon, he continued improving the cabin's defenses, fashioning crude but effective shutters that could be quickly barred from within. Joseph followed him like a shadow, eagerly fetching tools and asking endless questions about outlaws and justice. Emma, not to be outdone, presented Jacob with a carefully drawn picture of himself, recognizable mostly by the badge and hat that dominated the childish figure. "It's you protecting us," she explained seriously. "See? You're standing in front of our house." Jacob carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into his vest pocket. "That's mighty fine art, Miss Emma. I'll keep it safe." The little girl beamed with pride. As evening approached, Jacob saddled one of Grace's horses. "I need to ride into town," he explained as she watched him prepare. "Send a telegram to my superiors about the Blackwater gang's whereabouts." Concern flickered across Grace's features. "Is that safe? If those men are still in the area—" "It's necessary," Jacob said gently. "And don't worry, I know how to avoid being seen when I need to. I'll be back before morning." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." Something about her concern warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. "I will. Lock the doors behind me. Use the signals we practiced if there's trouble." The ride to Clearwater took nearly 2 hours at a careful pace. The small town was little more than a main street with the essential businesses: general store, saloon, blacksmith, telegraph office. Jacob kept his hat pulled low as he entered, wary of eyes that might report his presence to unwanted parties. The telegraph operator, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up as Jacob entered. "Help you, mister?" Jacob showed his badge discreetly. "Need to send a wire. Official business." The operator straightened immediately. "Yes, sir. Right away." Jacob quickly composed his message to the marshal's office in Cheyenne. "Tracking Blackwater. Gang near Clearwater. Stop. Harley Bennett and Elias Tanner confirmed. Stop request back up to Davis Homestead, 5 miles northwest. Stop Young." As the operator tapped out the message, Jacob surveyed the small office. "Any strangers been through town lately?" The man's fingers paused on the key. "Matter of fact, yes. Group of rough-looking men came through 2 days ago. Drank heavily at the saloon, asked questions about local farms." He frowned. "Actually mentioned the Davis place specifically." Jacob's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Wanted to know if the widow Davis had family nearby, how often she came to town." The operator's expression grew concerned. "I didn't like their manner, so I didn't say much, but others might have." "These men," Jacob pressed. "How many?" "4 that I saw. One had a bandaged hand, another his shoulder. The men from the cabin, plus 2 others. Not the full gang, but enough to cause serious trouble." "When did they leave town?" "Yesterday morning. Headed east, though that don't mean much. Easy enough to circle around once out of sight." Jacob nodded grimly. "Any response from Cheyenne will need to be delivered to the Davis homestead, and I'd appreciate if you'd keep my presence here quiet." The operator nodded. "Understood, Marshal. Though I should mention those men have friends in town. Been spreading money around, buying drinks. Might be hard to keep secrets." "Appreciated." Jacob left a coin on the counter. "For your discretion." Outside, dusk was falling. Jacob considered staying in town to gather more information, but decided against it. If the gang was planning another move against Grace and her children, he didn't want to leave them unprotected any longer than necessary. The return journey was tense, Jacob constantly scanning the darkening landscape for signs of trouble. About a mile from the homestead, he dismounted, leading the horse off the trail and approaching more cautiously through the growing darkness. Everything seemed quiet as the cabin came into view. A lamp burned in the window, and smoke rose from the chimney against the star-filled sky. Still, Jacob circled the property completely before approaching, checking for signs of unwelcome visitors. His knock on the door was answered by Grace's cautious voice. "Who's there?" "Jacob." The sound of the bar lifting was followed by the door opening just enough for him to slip inside. The relief on Grace's face was evident as she quickly secured the door behind him. "The children are already asleep," she said softly. "Did you manage to send your message?" Jacob nodded, removing his hat. "Yes, though I'm not sure when help might arrive. But I learned something concerning. The gang was in town, asking questions about you specifically." Grace's face paled slightly. "What sort of questions?" "Whether you had family, how often you visited town." Jacob's expression hardened. "They're planning something, Grace. And soon." Grace sank into a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What should we do?" Jacob crouched before her, his voice steady. "We prepare. At first light, I want you to pack essentials for you and the children. If trouble comes, we need to be ready to leave quickly." "Leave?" Grace shook her head. "This is our home. Everything we have is here." "And none of it matters if you're not alive to enjoy it," Jacob said gently. "I'm not suggesting abandoning your home permanently, just being ready if we need to seek safety elsewhere temporarily." Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. Of course. I'll pack at first light." "Good." Jacob rose, his knees protesting slightly. "Now, you should rest. I'll take the first watch. You must be exhausted after riding all day." "I've gone longer without sleep," he assured her. "I'll wake you in a few hours to take a turn." Grace looked as though she might argue, then thought better of it. "Very well, but promise you'll wake me. You need rest, too." Jacob nodded, though he had no intention of disturbing her sleep. "I promise." After Grace retired to her small bedroom, Jacob positioned himself by the window, his revolver close at hand. The night stretched long and quiet, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or distant coyote call. Despite his intentions, Jacob must have dozed, for he awoke with a start to Grace's hand on his shoulder. "You should have woken me," she chided softly, offering a cup of coffee. Jacob straightened, accepting the coffee gratefully. "What time is it?" "Nearly dawn." Grace settled into the chair opposite him, a rifle across her lap. "The children will be up soon." Jacob rubbed a hand over his face, annoyed at himself for falling asleep on watch. "Any disturbances?" "None," Grace assured him. "All quiet." They sat in companionable silence as the first hints of light appeared on the horizon. Jacob found himself studying Grace in the soft gray dawn, the determined set of her shoulders, the quiet strength in her hands as they held the rifle. Not for the first time, he marveled at her resilience. "What will you do," she asked suddenly, "after you've caught these men?" The question caught him off guard. "Move on to the next assignment, I suppose. There's never a shortage of work in my line." "Sounds lonely," Grace observed, not unkindly. Jacob shrugged. "It's the life I chose." "Is it?" She looked at him thoughtfully. "Or is it the life that chose you after your brother died?" The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Before Jacob could formulate a response, a sound outside caught his attention, the soft nickering of a horse where there shouldn't be one. In an instant, he was on his feet, motioning Grace to silence. She nodded, immediately understanding, and moved quietly toward the children's room. Jacob peered cautiously through the window, his hand on his revolver. In the gray half-light, he could make out movement at the edge of the property figures on horseback, approaching slowly from multiple directions. "They're here," he whispered as Grace returned. "At least 4 of them. Wake the children quietly. Get them ready to move if necessary." Grace nodded, her face pale but composed. "What's the plan?" We hold them off as long as possible. Help may be on the way from Cheyenne. Jacob checked his ammunition. If things go badly, there's a root cellar under the barn floor. Get the children there and stay hidden until it's safe. And you? Grace's voice was steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Jacob met her gaze directly. I'll buy you whatever time you need. Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement that went beyond words. Then Grace nodded once and returned to the children's room. Jacob positioned himself by the window, calculating odds and options. 4 against 1 weren't favorable, but he had the advantage of cover and preparation. If he could pick off 1 or 2 before they reached the cabin. The first shot came without warning, a rifle crack that splintered the window frame inches from Jacob's head. He ducked instinctively as Grace emerged with the children, both still in their nightclothes, eyes wide with fear. Get down, Jacob ordered, returning fire through the damaged window. His shot struck one of the riders, who fell from his horse with a cry. That root cellar's looking more necessary, he told Grace grimly. Is there a way to reach it without being seen from here? The back door, Grace replied, her arms around her trembling children. Through the kitchen garden. If we stay low behind the vegetables, we might make it. Another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls. Jacob fired twice more, forcing the attackers to retreat temporarily. Go now, he urged. I'll cover you. Grace hesitated, something like anguish crossing her features. Jacob, no time, he cut her off. Go, I'll find you when it's safe. Grace gathered her children close. Stay low, she instructed them. Follow me and don't stop no matter what you hear. Joseph looked at Jacob, his young face surprisingly composed. You'll stop the bad men? That's a promise, son. Jacob clasped the boy's shoulder briefly. Now mind your mother. As Grace led her children toward the back door, Jacob moved to the front window, firing strategically to keep the attackers' attention focused on him. Through the glass, he could see 3 men using the cover of rocks and trees to approach the cabin from different angles. The back door opened and closed quietly. Jacob caught a glimpse of Grace and the children darting toward the garden, staying low among the corn stalks and bean poles. A shot shattered another window, sending glass spraying across the floor. Jacob returned fire, satisfaction coursing through him as another attacker cried out in pain. You're outgunned, lawman, a voice shouted from outside. Throw out your weapon and maybe we'll let you live. Jacob recognized the voice. Harley Bennett, the man in the bowler hat. Funny offer from a man bleeding in the dirt, he called back. We just want the woman and her brats, another voice added. Hand them over and ride away. Ain't your fight? Jacob's jaw tightened. You made it my fight when you threatened children. He fired again, forcing one of the men to dive for cover. From his position, Jacob could see Grace and the children had nearly reached the barn. Just a few more moments and they'd be safely hidden. Then everything went wrong at once. A shot rang out from a direction Jacob hadn't anticipated. Someone had circled around to the side of the cabin. The bullet struck the wall near where Grace and the children were crossing the final open space to the barn. Emma screamed, stumbling. Grace scooped her up without breaking stride, but the damage was done. Their position was revealed. There they are, shouted one of the attackers. Get them! Jacob made a split-second decision. Firing rapidly to provide cover, he burst through the front door of the cabin and ran toward Grace and the children, his body between them and the attackers. Get to the cellar, he shouted as bullets kicked up dirt around them. They reached the barn together, Jacob slamming the door shut behind them. Quick, where's the entrance? Grace pointed to a trap door partially hidden beneath straw. There. Jacob helped her lift it, revealing a dark space below. Get down there, all of you. Not without you, Grace said firmly, helping the children down the rough wooden ladder. I need to hold them off, Jacob insisted. There's no time. The barn door splintered as something heavy crashed against it. Jacob spun, firing through the damaged wood. A cry of pain told him he'd found his mark. Jacob, please, Grace implored, one hand on his arm. The children need you. Something in her eyes, fear, yes, but something more made his resolve waver. The barn door shuddered again under another impact. Go, he said roughly, guiding her toward the ladder. I'm right behind you. Grace descended quickly. Jacob took one final shot at the failing door, then followed, pulling the trap door closed above them just as the barn door gave way. The root cellar was small and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. Jacob crouched beside Grace and the children, listening to the heavy footsteps above. Search everything, a voice commanded Harley again. They've got to be here somewhere, little Emma began to whimper. Grace quickly placed a hand over her daughter's mouth, murmuring soothing words too quiet for anyone above to hear. Jacob checked his ammunition grimly. 6 shots left in his revolver, plus whatever Grace had in the rifle. Not enough if they were discovered. The floor! Someone shouted above them. Check for trap doors. Jacob positioned himself at the foot of the ladder, revolver aimed upward. When I give the signal, he whispered to Grace, take the children and run. There's a back way out. Grace nodded, barely visible in the dim light filtering through cracks in the trap door. A drainage tunnel comes out near the creek. Good. Use it. Get to the Hendersons. Don't stop for anything. Before Grace could respond, the trapdoor rattled as someone tried to lift it. Jacob had secured it with a wooden brace, but it wouldn't hold for long. They're down here, shouted a voice above. Break it open. Something heavy crashed against the trapdoor. The wooden brace creaked ominously. Joseph clutched his mother's skirts, his young face determined despite his fear. I won't let them take us, Mama. Hush, darling, Grace whispered, pulling both children close. Another crash, and the brace splintered. Jacob aimed carefully at the widening gap in the trap door. Last chance, Marshal, called Harley's voice. Send up the woman and her brats and you can walk away. Jacob's response was a single shot that sent splinters flying from the edge of the trap door. A howl of pain followed, along with a stream of curses. Kill him, Harley screamed. Kill all of them. Gunfire erupted from above, bullets thudding into the earthen walls of the cellar. Jacob pushed Grace and the children toward the back of the small space. The tunnel, he urged. Go now. Grace hesitated, anguish clear on her face even in the dim light. Jacob. Go, he insisted, firing upward again as the trapdoor was wrenched fully open. A figure appeared in the opening. Jacob's shot caught him squarely in the chest, sending him tumbling down the ladder to land in a crumpled heap at the bottom. Grace finally moved, guiding her children toward a narrow opening partially hidden behind stacked crates of potatoes. This way, she whispered. Jacob provided covering fire as Grace helped first Emma, then Joseph into the tunnel. When she turned back to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, he knew what she was about to say. I'll be right behind you, he promised, though they both recognized it for the lie it was. Go, Grace, for the children. Another figure appeared at the trap door. Jacob's shot went wide as pain exploded in his left shoulder. A bullet had found its mark. He staggered but kept his position, determined to buy Grace and her children as much time as possible. Grace's expression was agonized. Jacob, remember what I told you, he said urgently, firing again, despite the pain radiating down his arm. They belong with you. Now go. Something in his voice, the desperation perhaps, or the truth behind his words, finally moved her. With one last anguished look, Grace disappeared into the tunnel after her children. Jacob turned his full attention to the trap door, where shadows indicated multiple attackers preparing to descend. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking his shirt. 3 bullets left. Not enough, but it would have to do. The first man down the ladder caught Jacob's bullet in the throat. The second managed to fire a shot that grazed Jacob's temple before Jacob's return fire dropped him. 1 bullet left. Jacob retreated toward the tunnel entrance, determined to make his final stand there, to ensure no one followed Grace and her children. A voice called down from above Harley again. "Give it up, Marshal. You're bleeding out anyway." "Come find out," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the pain clouding his vision. Silence followed, then murmured conversation too quiet to make out. Jacob leaned against the earthen wall, fighting to remain conscious. He had to hold on, had to make sure Grace and the children had enough time to reach safety. Minutes passed. No one appeared at the trap door. The silence stretched, broken only by Jacob's labored breathing. Then came a new sound from above horses' hooves, many of them, and shouted commands that didn't belong to the Blackwater gang. "U.S. Marshals, drop your weapons!" Relief washed over Jacob, so profound it nearly took his remaining strength with it. Backup had arrived from Cheyenne, against all odds, in time. More shouting above, a brief exchange of gunfire, then boots on the ladder. Jacob raised his revolver with effort, unsure who was descending. Jacob Young, you down there?" The voice was familiar Marshal Dawson from the Cheyenne office. "Here," Jacob managed, lowering his weapon. "Watch your step. Bodies." Dawson appeared at the foot of the ladder, lantern held high. His expression shifted from professional alertness to concern as he took in Jacob's bloodied form. "Christ, Young, you look terrible." He turned, calling upward. "Need a doctor here." "The woman," Jacob said urgently. "Grace Davis and her children. They went through a tunnel." He gestured weakly toward the opening. "Need to make sure they're safe." "We'll find them," Dawson assured him, pressing a bandana against Jacob's shoulder wound. "But you need tending first. You've lost a lot of blood." Jacob tried to push himself upright, but his strength failed him. "Promise me you'll find them. Make sure they're all right." "I promise," Dawson said seriously. "Now stop moving before you bleed out completely." The next hours passed in a haze of pain and semi-consciousness for Jacob. He was vaguely aware of being carried from the cellar, of a doctor working on his wounds, of voices discussing the capture of several members of the Blackwater gang. "Harley Bennett?" he managed to ask at one point. "Dead," someone replied. "Tried to shoot his way out. Fool choice." Jacob drifted again, this time into deeper darkness. When he finally regained full consciousness, he was lying on a bed in an unfamiliar room. Sunlight streamed through a window, indicating it was daytime, though he had no sense of how many days might have passed. "About time you rejoined the living." Jacob turned his head carefully to find Marshal Dawson seated in a chair nearby. "Where am I?" Jacob asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Henderson Farm," Dawson replied. "Nearest place with a proper bed. Doctor said moving you to town might kill you." Memory flooded back the attack, Grace and the children, the tunnel. Jacob tried to sit up, pain lancing through his shoulder. "Easy," Dawson cautioned. "You took 2 bullets, one in the shoulder, one grazed your head. Doctor says you're lucky to be alive." "Grace," Jacob said urgently. "The Davis woman and her children. Did you find them?" A smile touched Dawson's weathered face. "We found them. They're safe. Mrs. Davis has been quite insistent about checking on you regularly." He glanced toward the door. In fact, I reckon that's her footsteps I hear now. The door opened, and Grace appeared, carrying a tray. She stopped abruptly when she saw Jacob was awake, her eyes widening. "I'll leave you folks to talk," Dawson said, rising. "Young, we'll discuss the official report when you're stronger." After the door closed behind him, Grace approached slowly, setting the tray on a small table. "You're awake." "Apparently," Jacob replied, attempting a smile despite the pain. "The children." "Safe," Grace assured him, pulling the chair closer to the bed. "They're helping Mrs. Henderson with the chickens." She studied his face. "The doctor wasn't sure you'd survive the first night." "Takes more than a couple bullets to stop me," Jacob said, though the effort of speaking was already taxing his limited strength. "So I see." Grace's composure cracked slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You nearly died protecting us." Jacob reached for her hand, wincing at the movement. "It's my job." "No," Grace said firmly, taking his hand in both of hers. "Your job was to catch those men. What you did for us went far beyond duty." Unable to deny the truth of her words, Jacob simply held her gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had been prepared to face during the crisis. "What happens now?" Grace asked quietly. "With the gang?" "Most are dead or captured," Jacob replied. "Dawson will want my statement, but the threat to you and the children is over." "And then?" Her eyes held his, searching. "You'll move on to the next assignment?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Jacob had asked himself the same thing during his brief periods of consciousness over the past days. The answer that had come to him was as surprising as it was certain. "That depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether there might be a reason to stay." Grace's expression softened, hope mingling with uncertainty. "What reason might that be, Marshal Young?" "Jacob," he reminded her gently, "and I think you know." Before she could respond, the door burst open and two small figures rushed in, followed by an apologetic-looking Mrs. Henderson. "Mr. Jacob!" Emma cried, her face lighting up. "You're awake!" Joseph approached the bed more cautiously, his young face solemn. "Are you going to be all right, sir?" Jacob smiled despite his pain. "I'll be just fine, son. Thanks to your mother's good care, I expect." Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Children, remember what I said about letting Marshal Young rest. Come along now." "But we just got here," Emma protested. "And you can visit again later," Grace said firmly. "Mr. Jacob needs to recover his strength." With reluctance, the children allowed themselves to be ushered out, though not before Emma had placed a somewhat crushed wildflower on Jacob's blanket. When the door closed behind them, silence fell once more. Grace's gaze dropped to their still joined hands. "You were saying?" she prompted softly. Jacob took a breath, finding courage he hadn't known he lacked. "I've been a marshal for 8 years, Grace, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to form attachments. It suited me after Daniel died. Or I thought it did." Grace waited, allowing him to find his words. "These past days with you and the children, they've shown me what I've been missing, what I've been avoiding perhaps." He met her eyes directly. "I'm not good at this, Grace, at saying what I feel. But if you'd be willing to give me a chance, I'd like to see if there might be a place for me here, with you, with Joseph and Emma." Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Are you saying you'd give up being a marshal?" "I'm saying some things are worth changing for," Jacob replied. "If you'll have me." The tears Grace had been holding back finally spilled over. "The children adore you," she said softly. "And I." She hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. "I've been alone a long time, Jacob, telling myself I needed no one, that the children and I were enough together. But these past days, watching you with them, seeing your courage, your gentleness, I've begun to imagine a different kind of future." Hope rose in Jacob's chest, stronger than the pain of his wounds. What kind of future might that be? One where none of us had to be alone anymore. Grace's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. One where we face whatever comes together. Jacob raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her fingers. "I'd like that very much." 6 months later, the Davis homestead had undergone a transformation. New fencing surrounded the property, the barn roof had been repaired, and additional rooms had been added to the cabin. Jacob's badge was mounted in a frame on the wall, a reminder of the past, but no longer his present occupation. Spring had come to Wyoming, bringing with it new growth and possibility. Jacob stood on the porch, watching as Joseph confidently guided the plow behind their new draft horse, a wedding gift from Marshal Dawson and the other lawmen who had come to respect Jacob during his years of service. Grace emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dinner's nearly ready. Would you call them in?" Jacob nodded but made no immediate move to do so. Instead, he wrapped an arm around his wife's waist, drawing her against him. "Have I told you today how beautiful you are, Mrs. Young?" Grace smiled up at him, the contentment in her eyes a daily miracle to Jacob. "Only twice. You're falling behind schedule," he laughed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "My sincere apologies. You are beautiful, Grace Young, and I am the luckiest man in the territory." "And don't you forget it," she teased, leaning into his embrace. From the field came Emma's delighted laugh as she chased butterflies along the furrows Joseph was plowing. The sound carried on the spring breeze, a testament to the safety and happiness the children now took for granted. "I never thought I'd have this," Jacob admitted quietly. "A home, a family." Grace turned in his arms, her expression serious. "Do you miss it? The badge? The chase?" Jacob considered the question honestly. There were moments, occasionally, when he felt the old restlessness, but they were fleeting, easily dispelled by Joseph's eager questions about farming techniques, or Emma's insistence that he read just one more story at bedtime. "No," he said finally, "I don't miss it. Everything I need is right here." And as he called the children in for dinner, as they raced toward the porch with ruddy cheeks and bright smiles, as Grace's hand found his with the easy familiarity of true partnership, Jacob Young knew he had spoken the absolute truth. These children, this woman, they belonged with him, just as he belonged with them. Not because he had claimed them in a moment of desperate strategy, but because together they had forged something stronger than blood or law, a family built on choice, on sacrifice, and on love that had survived the most dangerous of tests. It was, Jacob reflected as he closed the cabin door behind them all, the most valuable thing he would ever protect.